All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know the drill, right? We find some fascinating sources, pick them apart, and then we serve up the good stuff, the insights that really matter. It's all about making you, the listener, well informed without spending hours sifting through endless information. And hey, if we can sneak in a bit of fun along the way, even better.
So, for today's deep dive, we're going to be tackling the art of effective communication. We actually got a ton of great stuff from an interview you found with Jefferson Fisher on The Diary of a CEO. And his whole mission is to help us argue less and say more.
Mm.
He really believes that the words we use have incredible power.
Yeah.
They can truly change everything.
What I found so compelling about Fisher's approach, beyond just the content itself, is just how practical it is. He tackles these really common communication scenarios that we all face, like how to navigate those heated arguments that just seem to pop up out of nowhere, or how to master those interactions in a professional setting. And even, how to better understand and connect with those personalities that can be, well, a little bit challenging, to put it mildly.
Yeah, definitely. He offers some really valuable strategies for anyone, regardless of what you do or who you interact with. Whether you're prepping for a high-stakes meeting, wanting to have smoother conversations with your loved ones, or just, aiming to feel a bit more confident when you speak up. I think there's something here for everyone.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. Where do we begin?
Well, Fisher kicks things off by talking about something incredibly fundamental,
Yeah.
the impact of breath and control.
Oh, yeah, that's right. His first key, if I remember correctly, is say it with control.
Exactly. And, it's so fascinating because he starts by talking about how even the smallest disagreement, like a tiny little argument, can actually trigger this really primal response in us, the fight or flight mechanism.
It's like our bodies are preparing for a physical threat, even if it's just a verbal disagreement.
Right. And it's not just about physical danger. Our brains can actually interpret feeling undermined or challenged, in a conversation as a threat. And boom, that same biological reaction kicks in. Heart racing, palms sweating, that whole stress response.
Yeah, we've all been there, right? So what's the antidote to this? How do we stay in control when those heated moments arise?
Well, Fisher has this surprisingly simple yet powerful technique he calls the conversational breath.
Okay, tell me more about that. This sounds intriguing.
So basically, it involves a 2-second inhale through your nose, followed by this little, almost like a sip extra intake of air at the top, and then a slow, controlled exhale through either your mouth or nose. It seems almost too basic, but Fisher really argues that this intentional breathing can interrupt that fight or flight response and allow your analytical thinking to stay online.
I can see how that would work. By slowing down your breath, you're essentially sending a signal to your nervous system that, hey, things aren't actually that dire. There's no saber-toothed tiger about to pounce.
Exactly. It's all about giving yourself that moment to regain composure and choose a thoughtful response, rather than just reacting impulsively. I mean, imagine the difference in a conversation if both people were taking those conscious breaths.
Yeah, it would probably be a lot less explosive, that's for sure. And he also talks about the power of something else we often underestimate: the pause. Like, imagine asking someone, "How was your day?" and getting a response right away. It feels so different than if they take even a brief moment of silence before answering.
Right, there's something about that little gap that communicates thoughtfulness and builds a sense of trust. It shows you're actually considering their question and not just, spitting out the first thing that comes to mind.
Totally. It's like you're saying, I value your question, and I'm going to take a moment to actually reflect on it before I respond.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that Fisher also connects pausing to how others perceive your intelligence, especially in settings like job interviews.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, he says that taking that brief moment of silence before you answer a question suggests that you're truly listening and considering your response. You're not just reciting some pre-prepared spiel or trying to fill the silence with empty words. It makes you appear more thoughtful and composed.
Huh, makes a lot of sense. It shows you're not just reacting, but actually processing the information before you speak.
Exactly. And, he tells this great story about prepping a client for a deposition, which for anyone who's never been through one, it can be a really intense and nerve-wracking experience. Lawyers are skilled at using leading questions to try and trap you. And in this particular case, the lawyer asked, "It's fair to say you didn't see that other car, did you?"
Oh, wow. That's a classic leading question designed to get you to admit fault.
Right. But instead of just blurting out a flustered denial, the client, after taking a breath, very calmly replied, "No, that's not fair to say." And that small pause, that deliberate response, completely change the entire impact of the question.
I love that. It's amazing how much power lies in that moment of composure. It prevents the other person from controlling the narrative and allows you to maintain your own clarity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the silence itself, but also about the pace of your speech. Fisher points out that slowing down the way you deliver your words can also project a greater sense of control. He uses the example of saying, "I already told you I'm not going to do that."
Yeah.
If you say that quickly, with a tone of frustration, it can sound almost childish, right?
Yeah, it definitely comes across as reactive and a bit whiny.
Right. But when you deliver it more deliberately, like, "I already told you, I am not going to do that," it carries so much more weight and authority. You come across as more confident and in control of the situation.
I totally see that. It's like those powerful pauses that actors use on stage to emphasize certain lines or emotions.
Exactly. It's about being intentional with your words and letting them land with impact.
And, he also briefly touches on the importance of understanding your own emotions, right? Like what triggers you, what sets you off. Because if you're not even aware of what pushes your buttons, it becomes so much harder to speak with control when those hot button topics come up.
Right. It's like trying to drive a car with a blindfold on. You're bound to crash.
Exactly. And he makes this really crucial point that the words you use have power, regardless of your self-esteem. It's the words themselves that shape the outcomes, not how you feel about yourself in that moment.
That's so important. It means we all have the power to communicate effectively, regardless of our inner critic.
Okay, so we've covered say it with control. What's Fisher's next key for effective communication?
His second key is say it with confidence. But here's the really interesting thing. He immediately clarifies that confidence isn't something you just, like, magically summon. It's actually a result of communicating assertively. Confidence in terms of communication isn't the starting point. It's the outcome of speaking assertively.
Oh, that's a really important distinction. So it's not about pumping yourself up beforehand. It's about how you actually express yourself that leads to feeling more confident.
Precisely. It's about the actions, the way you communicate, that ultimately create the feeling of confidence.
That makes so much sense. So how does he define assertiveness then?
Well, he describes it as this balance between being too passive, letting people walk all over you, and being overly aggressive, where you bulldoze over everyone else's needs. It's about respecting both your own needs and the other person's in the interaction.
Yeah, finding that sweet spot where you're standing up for yourself without being a jerk.
Right. And he makes this really, really direct observation. He says that being straightforward with someone, when you do it with the understanding that they can handle it, is actually a form of kindness.
That's a fascinating perspective. You're essentially saying, I respect you enough to be direct with you.
Exactly. No more beating around the bush or sugarcoating things to the point where the message gets lost. It's about being clear and respectful, trusting that the other person can handle the truth.
I like that. It's like you're giving them the gift of honesty. And speaking of honesty, he then dives into the nitty-gritty of word choice, emphasizing that every single word counts.
Absolutely. And his prime example, that
Absolutely.
seemingly harmless word, just.
Oh, yeah, that little word we sprinkle into our sentences all the time.
Right. He points out how often we use it as a filler, like in just wanted to check in or just wanted to follow up. And he argues that by removing it, the statement becomes so much stronger, like wanted to check in or wanted to follow up. It sounds more direct, more intentional, right?
Yeah, there's less hesitation, more certainty.
Exactly. It's a small tweak, but can make a huge difference in how your message is perceived.
It's funny because I'm thinking about all the emails I sent today and how many times I probably used just.
We all do it. It's so ingrained in our language.
Yeah.
But becoming aware of it is the first step to using it more intentionally, right?
Totally. And then he talks about this principle of saying more with less, which I think is so relevant in our world of information overload.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He argues that when we use too many words to explain something, it can actually sound less truthful.
It's like we're trying to convince ourselves as much as the other person.
Yeah, exactly. And it often leads to what he calls word vomit, where the core message gets completely lost in a jumble of unnecessary words and explanations.
Word vomit, haha, I love that. We've all been there, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, think about a time when you've tried to explain something and just ended up rambling and confusing yourself even more.
All the time.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's about being concise, getting to the point, and trusting that your message will be received.
And it's not just about what you say, but also when you say it, right? He talks about that person in meetings who always feels the need to jump in with their opinions on Literally every single topic.
Oh, that person. Yeah.
Right. And Fisher suggests that these individuals, the ones who always need to be heard, might actually be the least connected.
Because they're so focused on their own voice, on getting their point across, that they're not truly listening to what others have to say.
That's a really interesting perspective. And, it makes me wonder, what's driving that need to constantly interject? Is it insecurity? A desire to feel important?
Could be a combination of factors. Maybe a lack of self-awareness about how their interjections are impacting the flow of the conversation.
It's like they're so caught up in their own thoughts and ideas that they're not attuned to the dynamics of the group.
Exactly. And it's a shame because they're probably missing out on some really valuable insights and connections by not truly listening.
Totally. And then he contrasts this with confident communicators who he describes as often being quieter. They don't feel that same compulsion to prove themselves.
Right. It's like they have this inner knowing that their words have weight and they don't need to shout to be heard.
Yeah, it's a quiet confidence that speaks volumes.
And then he uses this really powerful analogy, talking about how easily triggered individuals are essentially giving their remote control to others. They're allowing external circumstances and other people's actions to dictate their emotional state.
Oh, that's a great analogy. I can see how that plays out in so many situations.
Right, like someone says something that triggers you and suddenly you're reacting in a way that you later regret. You've let them control your emotional state.
So what's the solution? How do we break free from that cycle?
Well, Fisher suggests that instead of giving away our remote control, we need to offer a manual instead.
A manual. What do you mean by that?
It means calmly stating your boundaries and expectations. It's about being proactive in defining how you want to be treated, rather than just reactively responding to every trigger that comes your way.
So it's about taking back control, setting those boundaries, and letting others know, hey, this is how I operate. This is what I will and won't tolerate.
Exactly. It's about respecting yourself enough to say, this is my space and you need to respect it.
I love that. It's about creating those healthy boundaries and protecting your own mental and emotional well-being. And, he also talks about the struggle so many of us have with saying no, right? That people-pleasing tendency.
Oh yeah, that constant need to say yes, even when our gut is screaming no.
And he connects it to another communication habit that can be so detrimental: over-apologizing.
The sorry epidemic. Like we're constantly apologizing for things that aren't even our fault.
And he makes the point that this constant apologizing can actually erode your self-worth over time.
It's like we're diminishing ourselves with every sorry we utter.
So what's the alternative?
Well, he suggests a really simple yet powerful shift. Instead of defaulting to sorry, try expressing gratitude. So instead of saying, so sorry I'm late, you could say, thank you for waiting for me.
Oh, I like that. It changes the whole tone of the interaction.
Right. It shifts the focus from your perceived mistake to the other person's patience or understanding. And it feels so much more empowering, doesn't it?
Totally. And he concludes the section by highlighting some common traits of really effective leaders, emphasizing their conciseness and directness in communication. No beating around the bush, no sugarcoating things, just clear, straightforward language, even in their emails.
Yeah, it's like they understand the value of their own time and the time of others, and they communicate accordingly.
All right, so we've got control, we've got confidence. What's the third key element in Fisher's communication framework?
The third key is all about connection. Say and to connect. Here, the focus shifts from just getting your point across to actually building a bridge of understanding with the other person.
I like that. And what I appreciate about his approach is that he defines connection in a very practical way.
Right. He says it's about saying something in a way that the other person can understand and receiving some form of acknowledgement in return. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree, but there needs to be this basic level of, getting it.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like you're on the same page, even if you're reading different chapters.
Exactly. And he shares this great piece of advice he got from his father. You don't have to like it, you just need to understand it.
Oh, I love that. That's such a crucial distinction.
Right. And he also gives this really helpful tip for starting difficult conversations. He suggests using phrases like, I'm not asking you to change your mind, but...
Oh, that's so clever. I can see how that would immediately lower the other person's defenses.
Exactly. It takes the pressure off and signals that you're not trying to convert them to your way of thinking. You just want to be heard and understood.
It creates a much safer space for dialogue, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then he outlines this really specific conversational frame for navigating those tricky discussions.
Okay, break it down for me.
So, first, you clearly state what you want to talk about. You set the topic right from the start. Second, you state how you would like the conversation to conclude. What's the desired outcome? And third, you get their buy-in by asking something like, does that sound good?
I like that. It's like setting the ground rules and creating a shared understanding of what you're hoping to achieve.
Exactly. It brings structure and clarity to what can often feel like a very chaotic and unpredictable interaction.
And he emphasizes having a clear goal for the conversation, but he also cautions against being too rigid and expecting it to unfold exactly as you've planned in your head.
Because, let's face it, conversations rarely go according to our carefully crafted scripts.
Never. There are always unexpected twists and turns, and that's okay.
Right. It's about being flexible, being able to adapt, and being open to the other person's perspective.
And this is a really key takeaway, I think. He emphasizes that the goal of the conversation should be understanding, not necessarily winning.
Oh, so important. He points out that winning an argument often comes at the expense of damaging the relationship.
Yeah, it's like a Pyrrhic victory. You might win the battle, but you lose the war.
Exactly. And then he introduces this concept of help me find the knot, help me find the knot, and asking what am I missing as incredibly effective ways to understand the other person's point of view.
I love those phrases. So like you're inviting them to be your guide, to help you see things from their perspective.
Right. It shifts the focus from accusation to genuine inquiry, which can be so disarming.
And then he uses this really vivid analogy of 2 glasses of water to illustrate how to create space for understanding.
Okay, I'm curious about this one. Tell me more.
So imagine your glass is already full of your own thoughts and beliefs, right? And you're trying to pour new information, the other person's perspective, into your already full glass. It's not going to work.
You're going to end up with a big mess.
Exactly. So you need to create space in your glass first. And you do that by asking questions like, how did you come to believe that? Or what experiences have shaped your perspective?
It's about emptying your cup a little so you can actually receive the other person's input.
Right. And he emphasizes that minds rarely change instantly. It takes time, patience, and a genuine willingness to understand.
And he shares this incredibly powerful story about a deposition with a witness named Bobby Labre. Initially, Bobby came across as very angry and aggressive.
Oh, I remember this story. It's a good one.
Right. But by simply asking, what am I missing?
Mm.
Quote, Fisher discovered that Bobby was actually a deeply worried son. His mother was in a nursing home, and he felt completely overwhelmed by the whole legal process. It was a really powerful reminder that the person we see on the surface isn't always who they are underneath.
It's so easy to judge people based on their outward behavior without understanding the struggles they might be facing.
Right. And, it connects to this idea of triggers, how past experiences can so deeply shape our present reactions. He gives an example of a friend who got really upset during a conversation about the pandemic.
Oh, yeah, that one really hit home for me.
And it turned out that this friend's intense reaction was rooted in feelings of inadequacy and being called stupid as a child.
Wow, so something that seemed completely unrelated on the surface actually had these deep-seated roots in their past.
Exactly. And, Fisher argues that becoming aware of our triggers, both our own and those of others, is a form of self-defense.
It allows us to navigate those sensitive areas with more compassion and understanding.
Absolutely. And he offers some specific advice for handling those situations where someone is easily triggered.
Like, what do we do when we can feel that tension rising?
Well, he suggests creating some distance in the moment. Don't try to force the conversation when emotions are running high.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes it's better to just walk away and come back to it later when things have cooled down.
Exactly. And then he suggests addressing it in a subsequent conversation using a frame like, I just want to understand where you're coming from so that I can do better.
It's about creating a safer space for dialogue.
And what about those people who are just, downright disrespectful? The ones who are intentionally rude or belittling?
Oh, those people. It's so hard not to react defensively when you're on the receiving end of that kind of behavior.
I know, right? Our natural instinct is to fight fire with fire, to throw it right back at them. But Fisher actually advises against that.
Oh, really? I'm intrigued. So what's the alternative?
Well, he has this fascinating 3-step method for dealing with disrespectful behavior.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, he recommends a pause. 5 to 7 seconds of silence. Just let their words hang in the air.
Ooh, I bet that silence can be deafening.
Right, it completely disarms them because they're not getting the reaction they were hoping for.
I love it.
Then, second, he suggests asking them to repeat what they said. especially if it was an insult.
Oh, I bet that would be so powerful. It forces them to consciously acknowledge those hurtful words again.
Exactly. And often when they have to actually say it again, it loses its power.
Yeah, it becomes almost ridiculous when it's repeated out of context.
And then third, he says to just let it sit. Don't engage further. Especially with insults, he suggests a simple thank you can be incredibly powerful.
Thank you. That's so unexpected.
Right. It's like you're saying, I heard you, but I'm not giving you the power to affect me.
It's like deflecting a punch with a feather.
Exactly. And for patronizing behavior, after that initial silence, he suggests asking questions about their intent, like, did you say that to upset me, or did you mean for that to sound rude?
It calls them out without being aggressive. It's brilliant.
Right. It forces them to confront their own behavior and the impact of their words.
And what I find so interesting is that he explains that often people who are rude or insulting are actually seeking a dopamine hit. They're trying to elicit an emotional reaction from you to get that little rush.
It's like they're feeding off of your negative energy.
So what's the best defense against that?
Be unresponsive. Like a wet blanket, he says.
Aha, I love that. Just extinguish their fire by not giving them the fuel they need.
Exactly. And, he does acknowledge that context is really important, especially when power dynamics are involved. But he also suggests that in certain situations, a statement like, that's below my standard for response, can be incredibly effective.
Oh, yeah, I love that line. It's so classy and assertive.
It's like you're saying, I'm not even going to stoop to your level.
And he shares that story about the mediation between two sisters where one sister made a really hurtful remark, and just by asking her to repeat it, the power of the statement completely dissipated.
It was like forcing her to confront the ugliness of her own words.
Right, and she was able to see how damaging they were.
And what's important to remember is that these techniques aren't just for those big confrontational moments. They can actually be valuable in everyday interactions, even in romantic relationships.
Yeah, I can see how asking for clarification, even in a playful way, can help to avoid misunderstandings and hurt feelings.
Exactly. And finally, on this topic of connection, he talks about preparing yourself for those difficult conversations, like avoiding them when you're not in the right headspace.
Yeah, don't try to have a serious conversation when you're exhausted or stressed. It never ends well.
Right. And he encourages us to practice self-awareness, to notice our own emotions in those moments, like literally saying to yourself, okay, I can feel myself getting defensive right now.
That awareness can be so powerful. It allows you to take a step back and choose a more constructive response.
Exactly. And he circles back to that idea of silence, emphasizing that it gives both people time to process and can actually prompt the other person to reconsider their words. Like, he uses the example of how silence can often make someone who's lying feel super uncomfortable.
Oh, that's so true. Silence can be such a powerful tool, both for ourselves and for influencing others.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground with those three keys: control, confidence, and connection. But he also touches on a couple of other important communication skills.
Yeah, like small talk and setting healthy boundaries, those are both so crucial.
Absolutely. So with small talk, his main advice is to focus on asking open-ended questions. The how and what questions, rather than those closed-ended yes or no questions.
It keeps the conversation flowing and avoids those awkward dead ends.
Right, and it shows that you're genuinely curious about the other person.
Yeah, and he even suggests having a purpose for small talk, even if it's just a brief interaction.
Like, what you hoping to gain from this conversation, even if it's just to learn one new thing about this person or brighten their day a little.
Exactly. And then, when it comes to boundaries, he uses this analogy of not giving anyone rent-free space in your head.
Oh, I love that analogy.
It's so true, right? We often let other people's opinions and expectations take up way too much space in our mind.
And it drains our energy and prevents us from living authentically.
So it's all about learning to say no effectively, right?
Right, absolutely. And he gives some really clear guidance on how to do that. Avoid making excuses or using the word but. Just start with a clear and direct no, followed by gratitude and maybe a touch of kindness.
No need to over-explain or justify yourself.
Right. Just a simple, no, thank you. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not able to.
And he also mentions those verbal fillers that we all use, like, bae and
Oh, yeah. Those little words that sneak into our sentences.
Right. And he points out that while they're totally normal in casual conversation, they can be less effective in more formal settings. And sometimes Just becoming aware of them is enough to start reducing their use.
It's all about being mindful of how we're coming across,
Yeah.
both in casual and professional settings.
Totally. And, then he brings it all together with this really profound statement about the essence of communication. He says, what you say is who you are.
Ooh, that's a powerful one.
It really is. He's saying that our words are a direct reflection of our character, our values, our intentions.
It's like you can't call yourself a kind person if you're constantly speaking harshly to others.
Exactly. It's about aligning our words with our values.
And then he talks about this journey of becoming a better communicator. He acknowledges that it's not always easy, that it takes time and effort,
Right. We're all works in progress.
and he encourages us to focus on one specific area at a time. Like maybe you want to work on reducing filler words or being more mindful of over-apologizing.
Yeah, choose one thing and really focus on mastering that before moving on to the next thing.
And he also suggests using tools like AI to help identify those areas where we can improve. Like there's some programs that can analyze your writing and help you to remove unnecessary words or phrases.
Oh, that's so cool. I need to check that out.
And then he revisits that say no image, reminding us to avoid that dreaded maybe and the mental burden it creates. He gives a coffee invitation example again, emphasizing that a clear no is always better than a wishy-washy maybe.
It's about respecting your own time and not overcommitting yourself.
Exactly. And, he also shares this anecdote about being honest in a social setting, even if it felt a little awkward at the time, and how much better it made him feel in the long run.
Yeah, it's about being true to yourself and not trying to please everyone all the time.
And he talks about the difference between a polite decline with a genuine reason, like, oh, I'm actually in the Middle East right now, and those times when we're just making up excuses.
Right, like when we say we're so busy, when we really just don't want to do something.
And he encourages us to just be straightforward, to say something like, I can't make it work, instead of piling on the apologies.
Yeah, a simple and direct no is often the most respectful approach.
And finally, he concludes by reminding us that every conversation has a ripple effect. He even talks about the impact of our communication on raising children, how we're setting an example for them with every word we speak.
That's so true. We're constantly shaping their understanding of communication and relationships.
And his final thought is so beautiful. He says, all the world needs is one better conversation at a time.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, one interaction at a time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Jefferson Fisher's insights on communication, we encourage you, our dear listener, to take a moment to reflect on what resonated most with you today.
Yeah, what strategies stood out? What feels most relevant to your own communication challenges and goals?
And if you found this exploration valuable, we highly recommend checking out Jefferson Fisher's book, Argue Less, Talk More. It's filled with practical advice and real-world examples, and he writes in a way that's really engaging and easy to understand.
And here's a final thought for you to ponder. Think about the last conversation you had where you felt unheard or misunderstood. What single choice, maybe, a conscious breath, a deliberate pause, a different way of phrasing something might have shifted the entire outcome of that interaction.
We encourage you to experiment with these ideas in your next conversations and see what happens.
And remember, even small changes can make a huge difference.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
We'll catch you next time.